The Ptolemaic Dynasty. The Ptolemaic Dynasty of Egypt ruled for nearly 3 centuries, from 305 BC to 30 BC, and they did it almost entirely by marrying each other. Founded by Ptolemy the First after the death of Alexander the Great, the dynasty was Greek in origin but Egyptian in setting, and they adopted the local religious tradition that pharaohs were living gods, a belief that conveniently justified keeping divine blood undiluted by outsiders. In practice, this meant brothers marrying sisters, uncles marrying nieces, and cousins marrying cousins across generation after generation, producing a royal family tree that looks less like a branching structure and more like a tangled knot. Ptolemy the Eighth, who ruled in the 2nd century BC, earned the nickname Physcon from his own people, a Greek word meaning potbelly, because his abdomen was so grotesquely distended that ancient sources describe him as unable to walk without assistance. The historian Athenaeus records that he moved through his own palace supported by attendants, his enormous frame, a public spectacle in a culture that associated physical perfection with divine favor. That a man this physically compromised was also one of the dynasty's most politically brutal rulers, exiling intellectuals, massacring rivals, and reportedly killing his own son, suggests that whatever cognitive or emotional moderation normally checks extreme behavior had been similarly worn away. Across the dynasty, documented patterns of paranoia, fratricide, and erratic decision-making cluster in ways that modern geneticists recognize as consistent with inbreeding depression, the reduction in biological fitness that occurs when recessive harmful variants are expressed through close-kin reproduction. The famous Cleopatra VII, the last of the Ptolemies, was actually among the least inbred members of her dynasty, and historians have noted that her political competence, she was fluent in 9 languages, and managed complex alliances with Rome for decades, may reflect this relative genetic relief. The dynasty ultimately ended not because Rome was stronger, but because the Ptolemies had spent 300 years systematically destroying themselves from the inside. The Julio-Claudian Dynasty. The Julio-Claudian dynasty gave Rome its first emperors and its most spectacular collection of physical and neurological anomalies, and the question historians still argue about is how much of it was genuine hereditary illness, and how much was the literary invention of writers who had every reason to make dead emperors look monstrous. Augustus, who ruled from 27 BC to 14 AD and founded the dynasty, was described by the biographer Suetonius as having abnormally spaced and decaying teeth, weak and unreliable limbs, a series of rough skin patches he found embarrassing, and such extreme sensitivity to cold that he reportedly wore 4 tunics simultaneously in winter. His great-nephew Claudius, who ruled from 41 to 54 AD, presented a far more dramatic profile, a pronounced limp that worsened under stress, a severe stutter that made public speaking an ordeal, hands that trembled visibly during formal ceremonies, uncontrolled drooling, and a laugh that ancient sources describe as unseemly and startling. His own family treated him as an embarrassment for most of his life, hiding him at public events which, ironically, meant he was the only adult male in the family who survived the purges of Caligula's reign, simply because no one considered him worth killing. Modern medical historians have proposed cerebral palsy, Tourette syndrome, and polio as possible explanations for Claudius's presentation. Then there is Caligula, who ruled from 37 to 41 AD and whose behavior wandering the palace at night talking to the moon, claiming to hold conversations with the god Jupiter, episodes of facial twitching and sudden violence, an inability to sleep reads in retrospect like a clinical description of temporal lobe epilepsy or severe bipolar disorder with psychotic features. The clustering of epilepsy across the family is striking. Julius Caesar had documented seizures. Caligula had episodes consistent with seizures, and Britannicus Claudius's son also had epilepsy and was conveniently poisoned before his condition could complicate succession. The dynasty produced 5 emperors across roughly a century, and not one of them died peacefully in bed. The Habsburg Dynasty. The Habsburg dynasty is the gold standard of royal inbreeding, the case study every geneticist reaches for when explaining what happens when a family treats strategic marriage as a solution to every political problem for 200 years running. They ruled the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, Austria, and significant portions of the Americas and Europe from the 15th century onward, and they secured those dominions the same way every time, by marrying relatives, then marrying the children of those relatives to more relatives, then doing it again. The physical result was the Habsburg jaw, a condition called mandibular prognathism, in which the lower jaw protrudes so far forward that the upper and lower teeth cannot meet, making normal chewing mechanically impossible. A 2019 study published in the Annals of Human Biology analyzed 66 portraits of 11 generations of Habsburg rulers, and found a direct, measurable correlation between each individual's calculated inbreeding coefficient and the severity of their jaw deformity. The more inbred the person, the more extreme the protrusion. The dynasty's most extreme case was Charles II of Spain, who reigned from 1665 to 1700 and whose inbreeding coefficient of 0.254 exceeded what would be expected from a sibling union, meaning he had fewer unique ancestors than a child whose parents were brother and sister. His jaw protruded so severely that he could not chew food properly and swallowed most of his meals partially whole, contributing to chronic digestive problems that left him thin and visibly unwell throughout his life. His tongue was reportedly so large that his speech was difficult to understand. He was bald by his mid-30s, suffered from intestinal problems so persistent that he rarely retained full meals, and was both impotent and infertile despite 2 marriages ending the Spanish Habsburg line entirely when he died at 38 with no heir. Researchers have proposed that Charles II suffered from a combination of combined pituitary hormone deficiency and distal renal tubular acidosis, both heritable conditions that his family's relentless intermarriage had concentrated to lethal levels. His father, Philip IV, had a jaw prominent enough that court painters adjusted his portraits to minimize it. The tragedy is that the Habsburgs understood, on some level, that something was wrong, and their solution was always another politically advantageous cousin marriage, tightening the very knot that was strangling them. The Russian Romanovs. The Russian Romanovs did not create their genetic crisis through centuries of inbreeding. They inherited it in a single generation from a single woman, and the consequences reshaped the political history of an entire empire. Queen Victoria of Britain, who died in 1901, carried a spontaneous mutation for hemophilia B, a condition in which the blood lacks sufficient clotting. Factor the 9th, meaning that injuries, which would be trivial for anyone else, become potentially fatal bleeding events. Victoria herself showed no symptoms. She was a carrier, robust and long-lived, but she had 9 children, and she married them strategically into nearly every major royal house in Europe, distributing the mutation continent-wide without anyone understanding what was happening. Her daughter Alice passed the gene to her daughter Alex, who became Alexandra, Empress of Russia, who passed it to her only son, Tsarevich Alexei, born in 1904. Alexei had severe hemophilia B, a bruise that would fade in days for another child, meant internal hemorrhaging that lasted weeks for him, bleeding into his joints that caused swelling so painful he was recorded screaming for hours at a time, unable to be touched or moved. He spent significant portions of his childhood bedridden, and by adolescence had developed permanent joint damage in his legs from repeated hemorrhages. The desperation of his parents, Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra, to find something, anything, that could help their son created the opening for Grigory Rasputin, a Siberian mystic who demonstrated a mysterious ability to calm Alexei during his worst episodes, possibly through hypnotic suggestion that reduced the stress-induced physiological responses worsening his bleeding. Alexandra became convinced Rasputin was divinely sent, and his influence over her and through her over Nicholas became a political scandal that weakened the dynasty's credibility at precisely the moment it needed public trust most. The hemophilia in Alexei's bloodline was confirmed not by historical inference but by direct DNA analysis in 2009, when scientists studying the recovered remains of the Romanov family identified the specific factor, the 9th mutation, tracing it definitively to the Victoria lineage. Alexei was 13 when the Bolsheviks executed him and his entire family in a basement in Yekaterinburg in 1918. A single genetic mutation, arising spontaneously in a grandmother he never met, had helped unravel an empire. The Spanish Trastamara line. The Spanish Trastamara line ruled Castile and Aragon before the Habsburgs arrived, and the Trastamaras contributed something equally destabilizing to the genetic inheritance of Spanish royalty, a pattern of mental breakdown that appears across multiple generations, with enough consistency to suggest a heritable component rather than mere biographical misfortune. The most documented case is Juana I of Castile, known to history as Juana la Loca Joanna the Mad, who was born in 1479 and died in 1555, after spending 46 years confined in a single castle at Tordesillas. The behavior that earned her that epithet began in earnest after the death of her husband, Philip I, in 1506. By multiple contemporary accounts, Juana refused to accept his death, traveling with his coffin for months through the Spanish countryside, periodically stopping to open it and kiss his remains, unwilling to allow his body to be attended by other women, even in death. Whether this was the expression of genuine psychotic grief, a recognized mental illness such as severe depression or schizophrenia, or a performance of instability that her father Ferdinand and later her son Charles V found politically convenient, historians continue to argue. What is documented is that Ferdinand used her apparent incapacity to justify ruling Castile himself, despite her legal right to the throne, that Charles V continued her confinement for decades after Ferdinand's death, despite having no medical justification on record, and that Juana herself reportedly had periods of lucidity in which she gave coherent and articulate responses. Her grandmother, Isabella of Portugal, had displayed similar episodes of mental withdrawal and breakdown, which points towards something heritable rather than purely circumstantial. Juana's son, Charles V, would go on to display the first clear signs of the Habsburg jaw in the Spanish line, making Juana the genetic and dynastic hinge point between Trastamara's psychological instability and the physical deformity that would define the dynasty that replaced hers. The Egyptian 18th dynasty, Amarna period. The Egyptian 18th dynasty's Amarna period produced what may be the most studied set of royal remains in history, and the more closely scientists examine them, the more complicated and troubling the picture becomes. Pharaoh Akhenaten, who ruled from approximately 1353 to 1336 BC, is depicted in the art of his own reign in ways that break sharply from every convention of Egyptian royal portraiture. An elongated skull, a narrow angular face, a protruding belly, wide hips, and spindly limbs that create a silhouette unlike any other pharaoh before or after him. Scholars have debated for decades whether these depictions represent a genuine physical reality, a deliberate artistic style meant to convey divine androgyny, or a condition such as Marfan syndrome, Klinefelter syndrome, or familial glucocorticoid deficiency. His son, Tutankhamun, offers more concrete evidence because we have his actual bones. A landmark DNA study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2010 revealed that Tutankhamun's parents were full siblings, making him the product of a brother-sister union, and that he suffered from an extraordinary accumulation of heritable and infectious diseases simultaneously. He had Kolar disease, a bone condition affecting the foot. He carried multiple strains of malaria at the time of his death, and he had a clubfoot so severe that 130 walking sticks were found in his tomb, a number that makes clear he could not walk without assistance. Despite the warrior king iconography plastered across his burial goods, he died at approximately 19 years old, and the current medical consensus is that no single cause killed him. Rather, it was the combination of genetic vulnerability, accumulated bone disease, and infectious illness that his compromised immune system could not overcome. 130 walking sticks for a teenager who was supposed to be a god king. The Ottoman imperial kafes system. The Ottoman imperial kafes system represents a different kind of royal deformity, not one written into DNA through inbreeding, but one inflicted deliberately by the institution itself onto the minds of the men it was supposed to be preparing for power. After a period of brutal fratricidal succession wars in which new sultans routinely executed all their brothers upon taking the throne, the Ottomans developed what seemed like a more humane alternative, the kafes, meaning cage, a system in which princes were confined within the palace harem from childhood, isolated from governance, education, military experience, and meaningful social contact until they were needed, which sometimes meant decades of waiting in gilded confinement. Ibrahim I, who eventually took the throne in 1640, had spent 22 years in the kafes before emerging as sultan, and what emerged was a man the sources describe as barely functional. He developed what appear to be the classic symptoms of severe long-term isolation and sensory deprivation: extreme paranoia, an inability to concentrate on governance, obsessive fixations, including a reported preoccupation with fur that led him to have his palace rooms lined entirely with expensive pelts, and episodes of violent rage that his court struggled to contain. He ordered the drowning of approximately 280 concubines in the Bosphorus, reportedly because he suspected one of infidelity but could not determine which one. So he eliminated all of them, an act of catastrophic violence that reflects not strategic cruelty, but the unmoored decision-making of someone whose capacity for proportional judgment had never been developed. He was deposed and executed in 1648. Mustafa I, who preceded Ibrahim and also emerged from the kafes, ruled twice, briefly in 1617 and again in 1622, and was deposed both times for evident incapacity. Contemporary court accounts describe him wandering the palace, feeding birds and throwing coins into the sea, conducting no business, speaking in ways his advisors found disconnected from reality. The caliphs did not select for madness. It manufactured it, reliably, by taking young men at their most psychologically formative and depriving them of everything a mind needs to develop into competence. The British royal family and the Victorian haemophilia dispersal. The British royal family under Queen Victoria achieved something no military campaign or plague had managed: the simultaneous introduction of a debilitating genetic disorder into the royal houses of Russia, Spain, Germany, and Britain itself, all through the instrument of strategic marriage that was supposed to be securing dynastic alliances. Victoria's hemophilia B mutation, almost certainly a spontaneous one with no precedent in her ancestry, passed invisibly through her daughters and carrier granddaughters into thrones across the continent. Her son Leopold, Duke of Albany, had hemophilia himself and died in 1884 at age 30 from a hemorrhage triggered by a minor fall. His sisters Alice and Beatrice were carriers, and their daughters carried the mutation further. Alice's daughter Alex became Alexandra of Russia. Beatrice's daughter Victoria Eugenie married Alfonso XIII of Spain in 1906, introducing hemophilia into the Spanish Bourbon line. Two of Victoria Eugenie's sons, Prince Alfonso and Prince Gonzalo, had hemophilia. Alfonso died in 1938 after a car accident caused bleeding. His body could not stop. He was 31. Gonzalo died in 1934 under similar circumstances. He was 19. The mutation had been identified, the mechanism was understood by then, and still, there was nothing to be done. Alfonso XIII of Spain himself showed physical features that observers noted as unusually prominent: a chin and jaw structure that seemed to echo the Habsburg ancestry several generations back, as if the dynasty's most recognizable physical marker was leaving a ghost impression across centuries of diluted bloodline. Geneticists studying the Victorian hemophilia dispersal have noted it as a textbook demonstration of how a single carrier individual, positioned at the center of a network of strategic marriages, can propagate a recessive, lethal mutation across an entire social class within 2 generations. The Qing Dynasty Late Period. The Qing Dynasty's late period presents a pattern not of dramatic physical deformity, but of systematic institutional fragility. Emperors who were children, emperors who were controlled entirely by others, emperors who died young under suspicious circumstances, and at least one emperor whose death was confirmed centuries later to have been murder. The Manchu founders of the dynasty maintained Manchu ethnic identity through a controlled consort selection system that drew imperial wives and concubines exclusively from a restricted pool of Manchu bannerman families, creating a closed breeding population for the imperial line across generations. Emperor Tongji, who reigned from 1861 to 1875, died at 18 officially of smallpox, though contemporary accounts and later historians have raised the possibility of syphilis, noting that he reportedly visited Peking's brothels disguised as a commoner, and that his death left no heir, forcing a succession that Empress Dowager Cixi managed to her own advantage. Emperor Guangxu, chosen as a child in 1875 to replace Tongji, spent his reign in effective captivity under Cixi, attempting one reform movement that she crushed in 1898 and spending his final decade under house arrest. He was chronically ill throughout his life, and in 2008, scientists conducting forensic analysis of his exhumed remains found arsenic levels in his hair and bones approximately 2,000 times higher than normal, confirming what suspicious contemporaries had whispered for centuries, that he had been poisoned. He died on the 14th of November, 1908. Cixi died the following day. The last emperor, Puyi, was enthroned at age 2 and deposed at 6. A sequence so psychologically dislocating that his own autobiography describes an adult life characterized by emotional detachment, an inability to form normal relationships, and a compulsive need for control that made ordinary human interaction nearly impossible. The modern European royal legacy. The modern European royal legacy of deformity is quieter than its predecessors. No jaw protruding past the chin, no coffin dragged across a kingdom, no emperor drowning 300 women, but the genetic thread running from the Habsburgs through Victoria, through the Spanish Bourbons, into the 20th century is measurable, documented, and in some cases, fatal. The Spanish royal house of Bourbon carried both the Habsburg jaw in diluted form and the Victorian hemophilia mutation simultaneously, having acquired the jaw through centuries of ancestry and the hemophilia through Victoria Eugenie's 1906 marriage to Alfonso XIII. The deaths of Alfonso and Gonzalo, 2 young men killed, not by war or illness, but by minor injuries, their blood could not manage, represent the human cost of 5 centuries of closed royal breeding compressed into 2 funerals. Before 1940, Alfonso XIII himself displayed physical features that contemporaries noted as unusually angular, with a chin structure that forensic portrait analysts have connected to the distant Habsburg inheritance, a trait so deeply embedded in the genetic material of European royalty that it surfaced 300 years after Charles II's death in the face of a man who had never heard of mandibular prognathism. Modern European royals practice outbreeding, and the extreme physical manifestations of the old dynasties have not recurred. But forensic geneticists studying exhumed royal remains continue to find evidence of what centuries of strategic endogamy cost: reduced immune diversity, higher clustering of heritable disease, skeletal anomalies consistent with inbreeding depression. The families that once controlled the fate of nations left their decisions written not only in treaties and borders, but in bones, and the bones keep talking. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.